Thank you for coming. Today's presentation is on career quakes, finding your career direction in a new era of economic instability. My name's Mitch Laurie and I'm Director of Career Services for the East Coast Human Resource Group. First, I'd just like to have a show of hands. Who's familiar with the concept of peak oil? All right, a number of you, that's good. Who thinks that global economic growth can continue as it has for the last couple of hundred years? Show of hands? Some. And who thinks life in Australia will change radically in the next 10 years? Okay. Well, here's what I think. This is an overview. I think it's a core cultural belief since the Industrial Revolution that economic growth is good, essential, and unending. And that all our beliefs about work and the economy have formed during this unique period of growth. However, today there's strong evidence that we are approaching tipping points that will prove this belief incorrect, and that centuries of economic growth will come to an end. And that as a result, society, the world of work and careers will enter a great transition, and that will experience major change quakes beginning within the next 10 years. Now, the end of growth, this is a big claim. What about evidence? Well, unfortunately, there's not enough time today to go into all the evidence. This is cut down from a one-day course, but I'll be presenting as much as I can in this brief period. So consider this as a hypothesis to examine and make up your own mind. You can do follow-up research at my website, transitionwise.org, where there's more evidence and links, as well as you can download this presentation. Warning, you may find at first that this presentation is a little disturbing or even depressing. But my purpose is not to depress you, but to empower you and provide useful insights to help you succeed in a changing world. Don't do this. Don't just stick your head in the sand and ignore the information that you hear today. Here's an outline of what we'll be covering. 6 growing global threats, or basically why growth will fail. Putting it all together, our probable future. How can this be? Now, looking at the question of, if this is true, why doesn't everybody know about it? And then, how can we prepare? Or more importantly, how can you prepare? Global threat 1, world oil production limits, commonly known as the problem of peak oil. I'll just play a short video to introduce the subject.
Peak oil is a theory that goes like this. The global production of oil will hit its peak and then start to decline. Now, it doesn't mean the world will run out of oil, but it means is that the world will run out of cheap oil. The idea has been around since the mid-50s. Back then, a Shell oil geologist named Marion King Hubbard predicted that U.S. oil production could hit its peak in the early 1970s. Well, remember that oil shock back in the 70s? It's nothing compared to what supporters of the peak oil concept think we're in for once the decline starts. Economic collapse, geopolitical conflict, and the end of your lifestyle as you know it. Factor in the rest of the planet and their growth and their needs, and what you've got is increasing demand and shrinking supply of a finite resource.
So, basically our whole society is built on cheap oil. It's absolutely crucial for transport, food, housing, and all these products that you see in this photograph. And most current careers wouldn't exist without oil. Why will conventional oil production peak? Well, it's a known fact that when about half of the oil in a reservoir has been used, then production flow goes into decline. And that when you look at areas or regions of oil fields, we see the same pattern emerging. The United States hit peak oil in 1970. And then despite major increases in technology and price increases, they haven't been able to increase their oil production since 1970. The world will peak when enough regions around the world have also gone into this peak phenomena. To give you an idea of the scale of the problem, have a look at this graph here. This graph here shows world oil discoveries. And they actually peaked here in 1965 ever since then, they've been in decline. And this is where we are today. This black line here is world oil production. So we're actually using far more oil than we're discovering every year. And this gap is growing. Now, obviously, you can't keep producing something that you haven't discovered. So it's only a matter of time before production also has to start falling in the same way that discovery has. And this is why we see that oil production has been on a bumpy plateau since 2004. And that despite oil reaching $147 a barrel round about here, they haven't been able to increase oil production very much at all. When might world peaking occur? Different approximations lead to different forecasts. A number of experts believe that we've already hit the peak. Then there's others that think that it's going to hit within the next 5 years. And then even the International Energy Agency, which is the Paris-based monitor of oil production, a very conservative body, which until recently has said, don't worry, we don't have any problems with oil. Well, just recently they've come out and said, well, actually, maybe we do have a problem, and production could peak as soon as 2020. What about alternative energy? Won't solar panels save us all from this problem? The problem is that it's too little, too late. If you can just see that tiny little sliver up there, that's the contribution of wind, solar, and geothermal energy to world energy production. I'm a great believer in solar panels. I have them on my roof, but they are not going to be able to make up for the shortfall in energy which we will soon be experiencing. And even coal and gas are expected to hit their peaks within the next 20 years. Basically, we always go after the easy-to-access resources first. And so the coal that's remaining is more and more difficult to mine, to get at, and to use. So net energy that we'll get from coal even will peak within the next 2 decades. What about the media? Well, in this country, there hasn't been a lot of media attention given to this, but it has started to get some traction in the UK. There was a UK industry task force on peak oil, which said that there's a call for urgent action to prepare the UK for peak oil, and that peak oil will destabilise economic, political and social activity potentially by 2015. Even Richard Branson has recently warned that the oil crunch is coming within 5 years. So David King, the former UK Chief Scientific Advisor, has said that governments around the world have their heads in the sand over the risks of their continued use and dependence on fossil fuels. Oil demand will outstrip supply by 2015. What about Australia? Well, the bad news is that Australian oil production peaked in the year 2000. Did anyone tell you that? Did anyone ever hear that? It's actually quite a significant fact. In 2000, Australia met all of our oil consumption needs. Now, we have to import more than 40% of the oil that we need. And if you see this black line here, that's demand. The blue line here is production. That gap is increasing. In 2005, the Queensland State Government established a Queensland Oil Vulnerability Task Force, which concluded that Queensland's vulnerability to the peaking of world oil supplies is particularly acute. Unfortunately, the government hasn't done much about it since this report. Dick Cheney, former US Vice President, stated that oil is the fundamental building block of the world's economy. So it's really the lifeblood of the economic system. And that's why when we look at this graph here of oil prices over the last 30 years, we can see that whenever there's been a spike in oil prices, it's triggered a recession. These grey bars are recessions. So actually the economy is very sensitive to energy prices. It's basically the whole economic system is designed to run on cheap energy. It's expected that after peak oil prices will rise and that demand destruction will occur. Basically, people will be able to afford less and less oil. And as a result of this, it will cause an economic recession and eventually a depression. Okay, global threat 2, climate change. Now, this is a huge, complex subject, which I'm only going to briefly touch on here today. But basically, the experts are telling us that Australia is already experiencing the effects of climate change and is likely to be one of the most severely affected among the developed countries. The CSIRO is warning us that Australia's climate change impacts will include more heat waves, less rainfall, more droughts, sea level rise. And as a result of these trends, we can expect that agricultural food production will fall in Australia. Global threat number 3, the dangerous nature of exponential growth. Al Bartlett, professor of physics, said that the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. Exponential growth is when something grows by a certain proportion every year. And at first, that doesn't add up to much. But it reaches a point where that steady growth of a certain proportion starts to go vertical. And this is what it looks like. And even small exponential growth becomes increasingly impossible to continue. Few people realize that just a mere 3.6% growth per annum means that something will double every 20 years. If anything, whatever it is growing by 3.6%, in 20 years' time, it will have doubled. And if it keeps growing, it'll double again. In 2008, the New Scientist magazine brought out a special edition called The Folly of Growth, and how the economy is killing the planet. And they made the point that it's taken all of human history for the economy to reach its current size. But on current form, it will take just 2 decades to double. Now, if you really think of that, it's taken all of history to reach the point where we're producing and consuming as much as we are now. If we want to keep growth going at about 3%, which is what most economists would like to see the global economy growing at, it means it has to increase by that much again in the next 20 years. Now, obviously, that can't keep happening. You can't just keep doubling and doubling the amount of resources that you're using and the amount of pollution that you're producing. It's only a massive one-off drawdown of fossil fuels which has enabled this really unusual growth that's occurred over the last couple of centuries. So coal, the energy we get from coal has enabled the population to increase to 2 billion, and then the oil has enabled the population to increase to about 5 billion, and then the energy from natural gas has enabled it to increase to over 6 billion. But if those energy sources start to decline, eventually the population could go back to what it was without that energy, back around the 1 billion mark. Kenneth Boulding, economist and philosopher, said that anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Global threat 4. There's multiple other limits to growth. It's not just peak oil, it's peak many things as resource declines approach. Topsoil and agriculture is showing signs of going into decline on a global scale. Phosphorus production, fish stocks, water supplies, and essential metals. And peak oil will hasten peak many things because cheap oil is essential for mining and production of all resources. Without the easy energy that we get from oil, it's very difficult to maintain the production flows of all these other resources.